The summer of 1943 was a season of reckoning on the Eastern Front. As the dust settled from the catastrophic German defeat at Stalingrad, Adolf Hitler and his high command knew they needed a decisive victory to regain the initiative against the Soviet juggernaut. Their answer was Operation Citadel, a massive offensive aimed at the Kursk salient, a bulge in the Soviet lines that jutted westward like an accusatory finger pointing at the heart of the German-occupied territories. At the spearhead of this great offensive would be Germany's newest and most fearsome weapon, the Panzerkampfwagen 6, Tiger them. These 57-ton steel monsters represented the pinnacle of German tank design, and in the wheat fields and rolling hills around Kursk, they would face their greatest test. The throaty rumble of the Maybach HL-230 P-45 engine echoed across the pre-dawn darkness as SS Oberscharführer Franz Staudager performed his ritual inspection of the massive Tiger tank under his command. At just 20 years old, Staudager was already a veteran of the Eastern Front, but nothing in his experience had prepared him for what the coming days would bring. He ran his hand along the thick armor plating of the Tiger's frontal hull, feeling the cold steel beneath his fingers. 100 millimeters of welded armor stood between him and the enemy, thickness that no Soviet tank gun could penetrate at normal combat ranges. The Tiger was more than a tank. It was a fortress on tracks, and Staudager knew that his survival and that of his four-man crew depended on understanding every capability and limitation of this mechanical beast. The Tiger I had been conceived in the dark days of 1941, when German forces first encountered the Soviet T-34 and KV-1 tanks, machines that could shrug off hits from standard German anti-tank weapons and destroy Panzer IIIs and IVs with impunity. The response had to be overwhelming, and German engineers delivered precisely that. The Tiger's main armament was the legendary 8.8 centimeter KWK 36 L56 cannon, a weapon derived from the feared Flak 18 anti-aircraft gun that had proven devastatingly effective against Allied tanks in North Africa. With a muzzle velocity of 773 meters per second and capable of penetrating 120 millimeters of armor at 1,000 meters, the 88 could destroy any Soviet tank at ranges where return fire was ineffective. The gun could traverse a full 360 degrees, and the Tiger's advanced Turmzielfernrohr 9B optics gave its gunner unprecedented accuracy at distances exceeding 2 kilometers. Staudager climbed up onto the turret and dropped down through the commander's cupola into the fighting compartment. Inside, the familiar smell of gun oil, leather, and stale sweat greeted him. The interior of a Tiger was cramped, despite the tank's massive external dimensions. To his left sat the gunner, Karl-Heinz Wormbrunn, already checking the traversing mechanism and loading a practice round. Behind them, the loader worked in the confined space between the main gun breech and the ammunition bins that lined the turret walls. Each Tiger carried 92 rounds of 88mm ammunition, a mix of armor-piercing rounds for dealing with enemy tanks and high-explosive shells for engaging soft targets and infantry positions. Below, in the hull, the driver and radio operator occupied their stations, the driver facing a complex array of instruments and controls that made the Tiger both remarkably agile for its size and notoriously demanding to operate. The Tiger's transmission was a masterpiece of German engineering and simultaneously its greatest weakness. The Maybach Olvar gearbox provided 8 forward gears and 4 reverse gears, allowing the tank to reach speeds of 38 km per hour on roads and about 20 km per hour cross-country. But the system was delicate, prone to breakdown, and consumed fuel at an alarming rate. The Tiger's operational range was barely 110 kilometers on roads and even less across rough terrain. Every commander knew that mechanical breakdown was as dangerous as enemy fire, and more than one Tiger had been abandoned and destroyed by its own crew when the transmission failed deep in enemy territory. July 5, 1943, dawned hot and oppressive across the Kursk salient. At 0330 hours, the German artillery began its preliminary bombardment, thousands of guns hurling high explosives into the Soviet defensive lines. For over an hour, the earth shook with the fury of the barrage, and then, as the first light of dawn broke across the horizon, the Tigers began to move forward. The 1st SS Panzer Division Leibstandarte SS Adolf Hitler, to which Staudigger belonged, was attacking in the southern sector of the Kursk salient. The division's heavy panzer company fielded 13 Tiger tanks, formed into a Schwer Panzer Company that would serve as the armoured fist for the assault. The German attack employed the Panzerkiel, or tank wedge formation, a tactical innovation designed specifically to maximise the Tigers' advantages. The Tigers formed the tip of the wedge, their thick frontal armour absorbing enemy fire, while their long-range guns eliminated Soviet anti-tank positions and tanks from distances where the enemy could not effectively respond. Behind the Tigers came the Panzer IVs and Panzer IIIs, the workhorses of the German panzer divisions, ready to exploit any breakthrough the Tigers achieved. The formation was supposed to slice through Soviet defences like a hot knife through butter. But the Red Army had prepared surprises of their own. The Soviets had transformed the Kursk salient into the most heavily fortified position in military history. Soviet intelligence had warned Stalin of the German offensive weeks in advance, and Marshal Georgy Zhukov had used that time to construct 8 successive defensive belts, some reaching depths of 150 kilometers. The first line alone featured anti-tank ditches, minefields containing over 400,000 anti-tank mines, interconnected bunkers, and carefully camouflaged anti-tank gun positions. The Soviets had studied the Tiger carefully, analysing every captured example and interrogating every prisoner who had crewed or fought against the German heavy tank. They knew that the 88mm gun could kill at extreme range, so they developed tactics to nullify that advantage: ambush positions, close-range engagements, and coordinated attacks from multiple directions. As Staudegger's Tiger crested a low ridge, he immediately identified the first line of Soviet defences through his commander's periscope. The wheat fields ahead were pockmarked with shell craters from the artillery barrage, but the defensive positions appeared largely intact. Before he could issue orders, a flash erupted from a camouflaged position 800 metres ahead. A 76.2mm armour-piercing round from a Soviet Zis-3 anti-tank gun streaked across the intervening space and struck the Tiger's frontal glacis with a tremendous clang. Inside the tank, the impact sounded like a massive hammer blow against an anvil, but the armour held. The Soviet round had no chance of penetrating the Tiger's frontal protection at that range, and Staudegger immediately ordered Warmbrunn to engage. The 88 roared, and the Zis-3 position disappeared in a ball of flame and flying debris. The Tiger's first-round hit probability at that range was nearly 80%, a testament to the excellence of its gun and optics. But for every position destroyed, 2 more seemed to open fire. The Soviets were employing pack-front tactics, concentrations of anti-tank guns that would remain silent until German tanks were well within their engagement range, then open fire simultaneously from multiple directions. It was a brutal form of attrition warfare, trading cheap anti-tank guns and crews for valuable German armour. By midday, the Tiger Company had penetrated nearly 6 kilometres into the Soviet defences, but the cost had been severe. 2 Tigers had struck mines, their tracks blown off, leaving them immobilised and vulnerable. Another had suffered a transmission failure and had to be towed back to German lines. The remaining Tigers continued the advance, their guns blazing as they engaged Soviet T-34 medium tanks and KV-1 heavy tanks that appeared from hidden positions and reverse-slope defensive positions. The 88 proved its worth again and again, punching through Soviet armor at ranges where the Tigers remained invulnerable to return fire. The T-34, which had terrorized German tank crews in 1941 and 1942, was helpless against the Tiger at long range. The Soviet 76.2 mm F-34 gun could only penetrate the Tiger's side armor at point-blank range, and even that was uncertain. Soviet tank commanders quickly learned that attacking a Tiger head-on was suicide. Instead, they tried to use their superior speed and maneuverability to flank the German heavy tanks, to get close enough where their guns might find vulnerable points: the thinner side and rear armor, the engine deck, the tracks. But the Tigers rarely operated alone. The German combined arms doctrine ensured that infantry and other tanks protected the Tigers' flanks, while the Tigers used their superior firepower to break open the enemy defences. The evening of July the 5th found Stordegger and his crew exhausted but alive. They had fired 67 rounds of 88 mm ammunition and claimed the destruction of 8 Soviet tanks and 4 anti-tank gun positions. The Tiger had taken multiple hits, but none had penetrated the armor. During the night, the crew performed maintenance, guided ammunition and fuel, and tried to snatch a few hours of sleep. Stordegger knew from experience that rest was precious and often interrupted. The Soviets were masters of night infiltration, and several times German positions came under attack from Soviet infantry armed with magnetic mines and Molotov cocktails, weapons that could be effective against even a Tiger if they could get close enough. July 6th began with an ominous discovery. Soviet aircraft had been active during the night, and as dawn broke, Stordegger could see fresh bomb craters scattered across the German assembly areas. The Red Air Force was contesting the skies above Kursk with increasing ferocity, and while the Luftwaffe still maintained local air superiority in many sectors, that advantage was slipping away. For tank crews, enemy air attack represented a particularly terrifying threat. Even the Tiger's thick armor could be penetrated by heavy bombs or rockets, and the psychological effect of being trapped inside a steel box while aircraft attacked from above was severe. The second day of the offensive saw the German advance continue, but at a slower pace than High Command had anticipated. The Soviet defensive positions were deeper and more sophisticated than intelligence had predicted, and the minefields were taking a devastating toll on German armor. The Tigers, despite their weight, were not immune to mines. A large anti-tank mine detonated beneath a Tiger's track could blow off the running gear, immobilizing the tank and requiring hours of repair work under fire. More than one Tiger crew had spent terrifying hours exposed to Soviet artillery, while engineers worked frantically to replace damaged tracks and road wheels. Stordegger's Tiger continued to prove its worth in tank versus tank combat. During the afternoon of July the 6th, his company engaged a Soviet armored counterattack consisting of approximately 30 T-34 medium tanks attempting to strike the German flank. The engagement demonstrated both the Tiger's superiority in direct combat and the desperate courage of Soviet tank crews. The T-34s advanced at maximum speed, attempting to close the range where their 76.2 mm guns might penetrate the Tiger's thinner side armor. It was a tactic born of necessity. Soviet tankers knew that engaging Tigers at long range was pointless, so they tried to rush forward, accepting terrible casualties in the hope that a few tanks might survive to deliver killing blows at close quarters. The Tigers opened fire at 1,800 meters, and T-34s began to explode before they had travelled halfway across the wheat field separating the two forces. The German gunners worked with mechanical precision, firing, reloading and firing again. The loader's job was exhausting, manhandling the heavy two-piece 88 mm ammunition in the confined turret space, while the tank rocked from the gun's recoil. But the crew's training paid off. A well-drilled Tiger crew could maintain a rate of fire of 6 to 8 rounds per minute, and at these ranges nearly every shot found its mark. The tactical exchange rate was brutally one-sided. 15 T-34s destroyed for no German losses. The surviving Soviet tanks withdrew, leaving burning wrecks scattered across the battlefield. Yet the Soviets learned from each engagement. Soviet tank commanders began to understand that they needed to change their approach to fighting Tigers. Instructions circulated through Soviet armored units detailing the Tiger's vulnerabilities. The tracks and suspension were identified as priority targets. Even if the main armor could not be penetrated, a Tiger with damaged tracks was a pillbox, not a tank. The commander's cupola, with its thinner armor and vision ports, was another weak point. Soviet anti-tank rifles, useless against the Tiger's main armor, could nevertheless damage periscopes and vision blocks, partially blinding the crew. The engine deck at the rear, protected by only 25 millimeters of armor, could be penetrated by most Soviet anti-tank weapons if a flanking shot could be achieved. The Soviets also began to deploy their newest anti-tank weapon in significant numbers, the 57mm ZIS-2 anti-tank gun. This weapon, whose production had been halted earlier in the war because it was considered overly powerful for dealing with earlier German tanks, was rushed back into production specifically to counter the Tiger and other heavy German armor. The ZIS-2 could penetrate 106 millimeters of armor at 500 meters, making it genuinely dangerous to Tigers if it could achieve flank or rear shots. Soviet crews manning these guns were trained to hold their fire until German tanks were well within effective range, then engage the sides or rear of Tigers while aiming for tracks and running gear. By July 8th, Stordegger's Tiger had been in continuous combat for 4 days, and the strain was beginning to show on both the machine and its crew. The interleaved road wheel arrangement that gave the Tiger its excellent cross-country mobility became a maintenance nightmare in the field. Mud, debris and stones would pack between the overlapping wheels, and in winter conditions, this mixture would freeze solid, completely immobilizing the tank. Even in summer, the road wheels required constant attention. One wheel bearing failure could mean hours of work to replace it, as the interleaved design meant removing multiple wheels to access a single damaged component. The Tiger's fuel consumption was another constant concern. The Maybach engine consumed 480 litres of gasoline per 100 kilometres on roads, and significantly more in cross-country operations. Each Tiger required constant resupply, and the German logistical system was straining under the burden of supporting the offensive. Fuel trucks and supply vehicles had to run the gauntlet of Soviet artillery fire and partisan attacks to reach the front-line units, and shortages were becoming increasingly common. More than one Tiger commander faced the terrible decision of whether to advance and risk running out of fuel in enemy territory or to conserve fuel and miss tactical opportunities. The crew itself was showing signs of exhaustion. Operating a Tiger in combat was mentally and physically draining. The interior temperature could reach 40 degrees Celsius or higher, and the cramped conditions meant that crews were constantly bruised and battered as the tank maneuvered over rough terrain. The noise was incredible. The Maybach engine roared, the tracks clattered, and when the 88 fired, the concussion in the enclosed space was stunning even with hearing protection. Crews suffered from headaches, hearing damage, and the psychological strain of knowing that at any moment an anti-tank round or mine could transform their protection into a burning tomb. Despite these challenges, the Tigers continued to advance. By July 10th, the 1st SS Panzer Division had penetrated nearly 15 kilometers into the Soviet defenses, approaching the small town of Prokhorovka. Intelligence reports indicated that the Soviets were massing armor in the area, preparing for a massive counterattack. The Tsakan's SS Panzer Corps, which included Stodegger's unit, was ordered to push forward and seize Prokhorovka before Soviet reinforcements could arrive in overwhelming numbers. The stage was being set for one of the largest and most brutal tank battles in military history. The evening of July 11th was tense. Soviet artillery had intensified its bombardment, and reconnaissance reported movement of large Soviet armoured formations toward Prokhorovka. Stodegger and his crew performed their nightly maintenance ritual with extra care. Every system was checked, every ammunition bin was topped off, and the engine received special attention. The Tiger's Maybach HL-230 was generally reliable, but it was complex and temperamental. Oil leaks were common, and engine fires were a constant danger, particularly in early production models, where quality control had been inconsistent. The crew knew that mechanical failure in the coming battle could be as fatal as enemy fire. July 12, 1943, dawned grey and overcast. At 8:30 hours, the Soviet 5th Guards Tank Army launched its massive counterattack. General Pavel Rotmistrov had committed his entire force, hundreds of T-34 and T-70 tanks, to a headlong assault against the 2nd SS Panzer Corps. The Soviet plan was audacious and desperate in equal measure. Rather than attempting to engage the Tigers at long range, where Soviet guns were ineffective, Rotmistrov ordered his tanks to charge at maximum speed, accepting catastrophic casualties to close the range where numbers might overwhelm German firepower and armour superiority. From his commander's position, Stodegger watched in amazement as waves of Soviet tanks appeared from the direction of Prokhorovka, racing across the open terrain at speeds approaching 50 kilometers per hour. The T-34 was fast and agile, and Soviet commanders were using that speed in a desperate attempt to negate the Tiger's advantages. The Germans opened fire immediately, and the carnage began. At 1,500 meters, 88mm armor-piercing rounds began to tear through T-34s, brewing up in spectacular explosions as ammunition detonated. But the Soviets kept coming. The battle quickly devolved into a chaotic melee as Soviet tanks penetrated into the German positions. The careful German combined arms tactics that had worked so well in earlier engagements broke down as Soviet tanks intermixed with German armour. T-34s attempted to ram Tigers or get close enough to fire at vulnerable rear and side armour. The engagement distances dropped from kilometres to hundreds of metres, then to point-blank range where even a T-34's gun could threaten a Tiger. Stodegger's Tiger fired continuously, the loader working like a man possessed to keep the 88 supplied with ammunition. The interior of the tank filled with acrid smoke from the gun, and spent shell casings littered the floor. In the maelstrom of Prokhorovka, Stodegger would achieve one of the most remarkable feats of the entire battle. According to the citation for his later award of the Knight's Cross, his Tiger engaged and destroyed 22 Soviet tanks in a single day of combat. The exact details of the engagement have been debated by historians, with some suggesting the numbers were inflated for propaganda purposes, while others point to the confused nature of the battle, where multiple crews might have claimed the same kills. Regardless of the precise count, there is no doubt that Stodegger and his crew fought with exceptional skill and courage in one of the most intense tank battles of the war. The tactical dominance displayed by Stodegger and other Tiger crews at Prokhorovka could not alter the strategic reality of Operation Citadel. By the evening of July the 12th, both sides had suffered enormous casualties, but the difference was that the Soviets could afford their losses while the Germans could not. Soviet factories were producing thousands of tanks each month, and the Red Army's reserves seemed inexhaustible. Marshal Zhukov had held back additional armoured formations that were now moving toward the front, ready to exploit any German weakness. The Wehrmacht, by contrast, was stretched to its breaking point across multiple fronts, and replacements for lost men and equipment were becoming increasingly difficult to obtain. On July the 13th, Hitler summoned Field Marshal Erich von Manstein and Field Marshal Günther von Kluge to his headquarters at Rastenburg in East Prussia. The news from other fronts was uniformly grim. Allied forces had invaded Sicily on July 10th, and Italian defences were collapsing. Hitler feared that Italy might withdraw from the war entirely, opening a new front in southern Europe that would require substantial German forces to defend. Additionally, Soviet forces were launching major offensives against Army Group Center, threatening to break through in sectors where German reserves had been stripped away to feed the Kursk offensive. Hitler made the decision that would effectively seal the fate of Operation Citadel. He ordered the offensive halted and elite units, including several Tiger-equipped formations, transferred to other threatened sectors. Manstein protested vehemently. His forces had been fighting for a week through elaborate Soviet defenses, suffering heavy casualties, and he believed they were on the verge of a breakthrough. Just a few more days, he argued, and the Soviet armoured reserves could be destroyed in mobile warfare, where German tactical superiority would prove decisive. But Hitler was adamant. The strategic situation had changed, and Germany could no longer afford to concentrate its best forces on a single offensive operation. On July the 17th, Operation Citadel was officially cancelled, and German forces began to withdraw from the positions they had seized at such great cost. For Stordegger and his crew, the end of the offensive brought mixed emotions. They had survived one of the most intense battles of the war and had proven the Tiger's effectiveness in combat beyond any doubt. Stordegger would be awarded the Knight's Cross on August 1, 1943, one of the youngest recipients of Germany's highest military decoration. But the survivors knew that something fundamental had changed. The Wehrmacht had committed its best troops, its newest equipment, and had achieved remarkable tactical victories, yet had still failed to achieve its strategic objectives. The myth of German invincibility, already badly damaged at Stalingrad, had been shattered beyond repair at Kursk. The statistics told a sobering story. Of the 146 Tiger tanks committed to Operation Citadel, only 6 were completely destroyed during the battle, a testament to the tank's exceptional protection and the skill of its crews. However, many more Tigers were damaged by mines, mechanical failures, or enemy fire and required extensive repairs. The German tank forces as a whole lost approximately 323 tanks and assault guns destroyed during the offensive, but many damaged vehicles were eventually recovered and returned to service. Soviet losses were far higher in absolute terms, with estimates ranging from 1,600 to over 2,000 tanks destroyed, but the Soviets could absorb such losses and quickly rebuild their armoured forces. Germany could not. The aftermath of Kursk marked the beginning of a long retreat that would ultimately end in Berlin. The Soviet summer offensive, launched immediately after the German offensive stalled, pushed Army Group South back toward the Dnieper River, liberating vast territories and threatening to cut off entire German armies. The Wehrmacht would never again mount a major offensive operation on the Eastern Front. From August 1943 onward, German forces would be constantly on the defensive, conducting fighting withdrawals and desperate counterattacks to slow but never halt the Soviet advance. For Tiger crews, the post-Kursk period brought a different kind of warfare. Instead of spearheading grand offensives, Tigers increasingly were used as mobile fire brigades, rushed to threatened sectors to blunt Soviet breakthrough attempts. The tank that had been designed for offensive operations now found itself in a defensive role, and while it remained formidable in combat, the strategic situation was beyond saving through tactical excellence alone. The Tiger's mechanical complexity, which had been a manageable problem when Germany controlled extensive rear areas and had time to conduct proper maintenance, became increasingly critical as the front lines contracted and repair facilities were captured or destroyed. Stordegger would continue to serve with distinction for the remainder of the war, eventually rising to the rank of Obersturmführer and commanding a Tiger company. He survived the war and lived until 1991, one of the last witnesses to the great tank battles that had decided the fate of nations. In his later years he spoke little of his experiences, perhaps understanding that his tactical victories had been part of a strategic catastrophe. The Tiger tank that had made him famous represented both the peak of German military technology and the fundamental unsustainability of the Nazi war machine. It was too complex, too expensive, and too fuel-hungry to be produced in the numbers needed to match Soviet mass production. The battle at Kursk demonstrated the Tiger's capabilities and limitations with brutal clarity. In direct combat, the Tiger was nearly invincible, outranging and outgunning every Soviet tank it faced. A well-positioned Tiger with a trained crew could dominate a battlefield, destroying enemy armor with mechanical precision. But tactical superiority could not compensate for strategic overextension, industrial inferiority, and the simple mathematics of attrition. The Soviets learned that while they could not match the Tiger's individual performance, they could overwhelm it through numbers, through sophisticated defensive tactics, and through relentless operational pressure that exploited the Tiger's mechanical vulnerabilities and logistical demands. The Tiger Eye that rumbled across the wheat fields of Kursk in July 1943 was more than a tank. It was a symbol of Germany's final attempt to regain the initiative on the Eastern Front. Its thick armor represented the shield Germany hoped would protect its armies, and its 88mm gun was the sword with which Germany sought to strike down its enemies. But wars are not won by individual weapon systems, no matter how formidable. They are won by nations that can mobilize their industrial capacity, maintain their logistical networks, and sustain their fighting forces through years of grinding conflict. By these measures, Germany was already losing when the Tigers rolled toward Prokhorovka, and no amount of tactical brilliance could alter that fundamental reality. In the years after the war, the Tiger achieved legendary status, appearing in countless books, films, and video games as the ultimate weapon of the Wehrmacht. Veterans on both sides spoke of it with respect, bordering on awe. Soviet tank crews who survived encounters with Tigers never forgot the terror of seeing those massive machines emerge from concealment, or the helplessness of firing round after round at armor that would not yield. German crews remembered both the power the Tiger gave them and the constant anxiety of mechanical failure, fuel shortages, and overwhelming enemy numbers. The Tiger was the beast of Kursk, but Kursk was its last hurrah, the final moment when German armor superiority seemed sufficient to turn the tide of war. The wheat fields and rolling hills around Kursk are peaceful now, the scars of battle long since healed. But beneath the soil lie the remnants of one of history's greatest armoured clashes, shattered T-34s, burned-out Tigers, unexploded ammunition, and the bones of young men who died in machines of war. The battle decided nothing less than the future of Europe, and while the Tiger Eye wrote its legend in the smoke and fire of Prokhorovka, it could not change the outcome. The beast of Kursk had roared with devastating effect, but the tide of history was turning, and no single weapon, no matter how fearsome, could hold it back. The summer of 1943 marked the high watermark of German power on the Eastern Front, and from that moment forward there would be only retreat, defeat, and ultimately destruction. The Tiger had proven itself the most formidable tank of its era, but in doing so, it also revealed the futility of tactical excellence in the face of strategic inevitability.